This is Green Street, the Environmental Health Show, greenstreetnews.org, Patti and Doug Wood, and our worldwide network of experts here every week to keep you up to date on what's happening in the world of environmental health and what you need to know to keep yourself and your family safe and healthy in this increasingly toxic world. Welcome back.
This is a special edition of Green Street because we have as our guest today one of our heroes, the nation's preeminent expert on environmental health, Dr. Philip Landrigan. Dr. Landrigan is a pediatrician and public health physician, currently the director of the Program for Global Public Health and the Common Good, and director of the Global Observatory on Planet Health at the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society at Boston College. Recently, Dr. Landrigan was involved in an international study on the popular weed-killing chemical glyphosate, known as Roundup, showing that exposure causes dramatic increases in cancer. The study was carried out by the Schiller Institute in Italy, and we started our conversation talking about how Dr. Landrigan was involved. Here is our conversation with Dr. Philip Landrigan.
For many years, I have been the chair of the International Scientific Advisory Committee for the Schiller Institute. Schiller Institute is one of the world's largest independent toxicology testing laboratories. Independent meaning that it's not controlled in any way by the pesticide or the agricultural industry. It's supported heavily by the citizens of the city of Bologna and the region of Emilia-Romagna. They get some additional support from the Italian government and then private foundations, but nothing to do with industry. And they've been in business for about 50 years. And over the years, they have been ahead of the curve on one investigation after another. They were one of the first toxicology labs to show that asbestos can cause human cancer, that benzene can cause leukemia and lymphoma. They have worked on aspartame, the artificial sweetener, and shown that it is linked to a number of malignancies, and that prenatal exposure of female rats to aspartame increases the risk of cancer in their offspring. So in other words, childhood cancer in humans. And this study on glyphosate is the latest in a long series. And the typical way that Schiller Institute does their studies is that they expose the animals beginning before birth, which is to say they expose the pregnant dams, and then they follow the animals across their entire natural lifespan until the animals die. And then they do a postmortem on every single animal as they die. That's different from most toxicology testing, which starts administering the chemical during adolescence or early adulthood for the animals and maintains the animals for a set period of time, typically 12 months or 24 months, and then sacrifices them. And the trouble with that truncated design, which is the typical design, is that it misses stuff at both ends of life. It misses the impacts of early life exposure when most organisms are most vulnerable to carcinogens and other toxic chemicals. And by sacrificing the animals most commonly at 2 years of age, that would be like sacrificing humans at age 60 or 65, it misses the great increase in incidence of cancers that occurs in later life. But the Schiller Institute, by looking at the whole lifespan, captures the full spectrum of what a chemical can do to a living organism.
It's so interesting.
That was the design they applied in the glyphosate study.
And I just want to focus for a second on your word independent, because so many of the studies we hear about, I'll put it that way, are funded, by the industry to get they're looking for a certain result and they look around till they find it. Am I jaded, or is that the way you see it?
No, unfortunately, it's all too true. Study after study has shown that industry-supported studies are far more likely than independently supported studies to find that the chemical causes no adverse effect.
Yeah.
We saw that back in the 70s when Herb Needleman and I were doing studies of childhood lead exposure. We actually put together a little graph looking at that. And of 20-some independently conducted studies, all but one showed that lead caused low-level brain damage in children. And it turned out that the one outlier was a study that had been funded by industry, but the guy did not and the scientists did not initially acknowledge that support. And that on the other side of the ledger, approximately 15 studies that had been supported by the industry uniformly, without exception, found no evidence that lead caused brain damage to children at low levels of exposure.
Right. And those studies find their way into Congress and, places where they make laws about everyday exposures, and talk a little bit about Herb Needleman and his ability to get lead out of gasoline and what happened to him.
Yeah, so Herb and I, in separate studies, my study in El Paso, Texas, his study in the Boston area, we were among the first to show that levels of lead in children that are too low to cause any obvious symptoms nonetheless reduced children's IQ and had other neurobehavioral problems in children. And we each published our studies. I published mine in The Lancet. He published his in the New England Journal of Medicine. He was viciously attacked by the lead industry. I was attacked, but they couldn't do much to me because I was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Public Health Service. At the time, I was working for the government. I was protected. But Herb, on the other hand, was at that time a research scientist in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh. And the University of Pittsburgh basically reacted at the first whiff of scandal before anything was proven. They locked Herb out of his laboratory. They refused to support him. He had to raise his own funds from his own resources and from friends and colleagues to meet his legal defenses. And eventually, after 3.5, 4 years, he was fully exonerated. The two scientists who had come into his lab under the guise of wanting to collaborate with him and see how he did his analyses turned out to have been in the employ of the lead industry, which they had not revealed to Herb when they requested permission to work in his lab. The so-called intentional errors that were found in his laboratory notebooks were minor decimal point issues and typographical errors, stuff like that I suspect any of us have committed at one time, but certainly no deliberate fraud. He was eventually officially exonerated by the National Institutes of Health of any scientific misconduct, and he received numerous awards in the years that followed. One was received the Heinz Award for the environment for his work. But the 3 or 4 years that Herb was locked out of his lab and pilloried took a terrible toll on him. And he was, even though he continued to work for a few more years, after a few years he developed Parkinson's disease, which eventually took his life. And I have no doubt that the experience of those years shortened his life. It was a terrible, terrible time.
Yeah, no doubt.
But based on your research, Phil, wasn't that the impetus for getting lead out of gasoline?
Yes. That the work that Herb and I did in the 70s was fundamental to persuading the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to take lead out of gasoline and out of paint. And the effect of those changes has been to reduce the average blood lead level in American children by 95%, to greatly reduce the frequency with which children are diagnosed with lead poisoning. And we calculated that it has raised the average IQ of every American child born since 1980 by about 5 points, which is why our grandchildren are smarter than we are.
That's why, Doug.
That explains it. Now we know.
All right. Sorry for that diversion, but you mentioned Herb Needleman, and I thought that his story was worth telling.
Yeah.
And such wonderful work that the two of you did on this.
No, I consider Herb to be a hero for science, or some would say a martyr for science. Yeah.
And we're still dealing with the lead problem. We're still dealing with the water delivery pipes in cities across America that are filled with lead, and people are still being exposed.
Today, in 2025, we still have over 500,000 children with elevated blood lead levels, which is defined today as a blood lead level greater than 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. The predominant source is still lead paint. Lead paint and the dust that arises from the erosion of lead paint gets into house dust is still the predominant source. And then lead in drinking water is number 2. And then beyond those, there are a whole series of smaller sources, imported spices, the occasional lead painted toy, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But paint and drinking water are still the big two. And we were starting to do something about the lead in drinking water problem during the Biden administration. Biden allocated funding to remove lead pipes in cities and towns across the USA. And that work was proceeding. I'm not sure what has happened in the last 6 months.
Patty read a news article, I think, on our show last week that said that the city of Chicago expected it was going to take, was it 50 years? Am I wrong? It's going to take 50 years to replace all of the pipes.
Chicago had one of the worst lead pipe problems in the country. Most cities, Boston, New York, it's small geographic areas, typically the older parts of the cities. But if I'm not mistaken, Chicago had an ordinance in place for a number of years that required lead pipes, and so it's a bit of an outlier.
Yeah.
And of course, it's expensive to remove lead pipes or any other source of lead. But there's two things to bear in mind when you think about those costs. Measuring the costs of removal is only one side of the economic equation. On the other side, every child who is damaged by lead and whose IQ is reduced is going to have reduced earning capacity across their whole lifetime because they're not as intelligent, they're not as clever.
Right.
And you multiply that by thousands or even millions of children, it becomes a very substantial cost. Usually, when it comes to sort of the standard equation that has been worked out over the years, is that every dollar invested in control of pollution gives a return on investment of about 20 to 1 through reducing healthcare costs and increasing the economic productivity of the population. And remember, finally, that the cost of removing lead pipes or removing lead paint is a one-time cost, but it protects every generation of children who are exposed to those sources in the years that follow.
Convincing legislators and other decision makers to include that downstream health cost in their analysis of cost benefit has always been a problem for a long time, and I hope we finally get over that. I want to move to the glyphosate study. Glyphosate is still omnipresent in our world, most popular pesticide, I believe, in the world. And there's controversy about its health implications. Talk to us about what you guys found in the Ramazzini study.
So the Ramazzini study looked at 10 groups of rats. Three groups were exposed to the European formulation of glyphosate. 3 groups were exposed to the American formulation. 3 groups were exposed to pure glyphosate, just the chemical, not a commercial formulation. And then the last group, the 10th group, was exposed to nothing. And in the 3 exposed groups, the glyphosate group, the European group, and the American group, there were rats exposed at a very low level, rats exposed at a somewhat higher level, and rats exposed at a still higher level. But all of those exposed rats were exposed at levels that fall within current exposure guideline levels in the USA and Europe. In other words, you hear this trope from industry that the rats were exposed to levels 10,000 times higher than any human being might be exposed to. That is simply not, that's not true. That's a straight lie. The animals were exposed at 3 different dose levels, but all dose levels were within the acceptable range. And the main finding that emerged from those studies was that the rats had excess cancers, or I should say excess tumors, because some were benign and some were malignant, but they had excess tumors at, I believe it was 13 different anatomic locations in their bodies. And generally speaking, the frequency of tumors, frequency of cancers was greater at higher levels of exposure, which is a standard indicator that there's a cause and effect relationship going on.
Right.
Well, there's probably the single most notable finding that came out of this was a very sharp increase in leukemia in the animals. Leukemia is not a cancer that is seen very often in experimental animals. It just isn't. Not at the Ramazzini Institute, not in the National Institutes of Health in the USA, with whom the Ramazzini Institute is in close communication. And there was a very striking increase, and a positive dose-response relationship was seen in that increase, which is to say that higher rates in the more heavily exposed rats. And about 40% of the leukemias occurred in the first year of the rat's life, which would be equivalent to leukemia occurring before the age of 35 or 40 years in a human. a finding which I think may have implications for childhood leukemia.
So a lot of people who are not familiar with how science is done maybe say, oh, this is an animal study that doesn't really relate to people. Can you talk a little bit about how these animals, these are Sprague Dawley rats, I believe?
Sprague Dawley rats, yes.
Talk a little bit about why we use them as surrogates for humans. I mean, besides the moral point of not exposing humans to.
Yeah, obviously it would not be ethical to deliberately expose humans to these chemicals. So we use rats for, first and foremost, for the ethical reason. Secondly, because it turns out that they have a very great genetic similarity to humans, just thousands of genes in common between rats and humans. And after all, we're both mammals, and we're both in the same great branch of the tree of life, and we just have a lot in common. And then, operationally speaking, every single chemical that has been found to cause cancer in humans also causes cancer in rats, without exception. Now, there are other chemicals that have been found to cause cancer in rats that have not been found to cause cancer in humans, or at least not yet. And that reflects the fact that it's easier and quicker to do toxicologic studies in rats than it is to do epidemiological studies in humans. But every single known human carcinogen is also carcinogenic in rats. And so anybody who dismisses rat data as not relevant to the human condition, in my opinion, does so at their peril.
And let's talk a little bit about the prevalence of glyphosate in our world. We've got glyphosate certainly happening in residue form in our food system all over the world. You just talk about the paths of exposure, the routes of exposure for humans.
Yeah, well, for the general population, the main route of exposure is food. And the way it gets into food is that glyphosate is applied to crops during the growing season to prevent the growth of weeds. And 25 years ago, when glyphosate was new on the market, it was magical. The farmers would spray it a couple of times over the course of the year. They didn't have to deal with weeds. It greatly reduced the work of farming. But what has happened in the years since that time is that the weeds have evolved, just the way bacteria evolve when people get too many antibiotics. The weeds have evolved, and there are now weeds out there that are resistant to glyphosate. Not absolutely resistant, but at least relatively resistant, which means that the farmers have to spray glyphosate not a couple or three times, but 4 or 5 or 7 times over the growing season. And then another practice that farmers have fallen into is that they will often spray glyphosate just before harvest to desiccate the plant, the corn or the soy, to dry the plant out to make the harvest easier. And the problem with applying the glyphosate that close to harvest time is that the glyphosate is still on the corn or still in the soy or the other crop when it is harvested and gets taken to the feed mill and turned into cornmeal or whatever other downstream product is produced. And the consequence of that is that glyphosate is now showing up in breakfast cereal and other foods that are not USDA certified organic.
Right. And in foods that children eat commonly, right? I mean, when you say breakfast cereal, I just think, oh my goodness, how many kids pour themselves a bowl of cereal in the morning?
Exactly. Yes, I didn't want to mention any brand names, but that's exactly where it is. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And in processed foods where, corn syrup and all those downstream products that they make are in so many processed foods.
That's correct, because a lot of the corn is something like 90% of the corn grown in the United States is now treated with glyphosate. And much of that corn ends up in high fructose corn syrup, which contains glyphosate now. And then, as you say, Patty, that high fructose corn syrup is a common ingredient in vast numbers of highly processed foods.
You're listening to Green Street, and our guest today is renowned pediatrician and public health expert, Dr. Philip Landrigan of Boston College.
We've been reading articles that, some of the crops that are being grown that were genetically modified crops that were grown to withstand multiple applications of glyphosate are now turning to possibly more dangerous. I don't know what could be more dangerous than cancer-causing herbicides, but turning to 2,4-D as a weed killer on crops in the agricultural world.
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct. And let me back up and explain what's going on here. So the Monsanto Bayer, who are the company that are centrally involved here, have in their employment some superb plant geneticists. And these are geneticists who have learned how to put genes into the seeds of corn and soybeans and other commodity crops so that when the crops grow, they have particular properties. Now, they could have done some very interesting and beneficial things with this technology. They could, for example, have put in genes that increase the content of folic acid or other vitamins in the corn. Or they could have put in genes that allow corn to grow in brackish water, like a salt marsh, which would be very beneficial in a place like Bangladesh, perhaps. Instead, they made the decision to put genes into the corn that make the genes resistant to herbicides. And the first one that they spliced in 25 or 30 years ago was the gene that made the crops resistant to glyphosate. And so the GMO, the genetically modified corn containing the glyphosate-resistant gene, is the corn that now accounts for 90% of American corn and 90-some% of American soybeans and so on, contain the glyphosate-resistant gene. As it became apparent to farmers and to Monsanto that the weeds were developing the ability to resist glyphosate. In other words, they were developing their own glyphosate-resistant gene under the pressure of evolution. What the plant geneticists did was that they engaged in what's called stacking, which is to say they stacked in several different genes into the corn and soybeans, as many as 5, I understand, enabling the crops to resist not only glyphosate, but also 2,4-D and dicamba, and maybe a couple of others. And my understanding is that use of dicamba and 2,4-D, 2,4-D, you may recall, is a component of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. Use of those very toxic older herbicides is now increasing in response to the changing patterns of weed resistance.
I want to ask you about IARC, the International Agent for Research on Cancer. So what's their stance currently on glyphosate, and do you expect that to change as a result of the Ramazzini study?
Well, the International Agency for Research on Cancer is the cancer agency of the World Health Organization. And I can't speak for the present time, but previously, in the last decade, it was an extremely well-led, well-managed agency that took great pride in the fact that they weeded out conflict of interest from their evaluations of chemicals. They have a whole big program that evaluates chemicals to determine whether the chemicals can cause cancer in humans, and it's called the Monographs program. And that program was superbly well run by a German scientist named Kurt Streif, who has also worked with me here at Boston College. And Kurt weeded out conflict of interest so that in the 10 or 15 years that he was running the Monographs program at IARC, the program was free of influence by the chemical and pesticide industries. It was really a model of independence under his leadership. And it was during the time of his leadership that IARC did an evaluation of glyphosate. They reviewed the toxicologic data, the epidemiologic data, what they call mechanistic data, which is cellular and DNA toxicity and so on, and came to the conclusion in their measured language is that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. That's their second highest category. If they say a chemical is a sufficient human carcinogen, that means definite, then comes probable, then comes possible, then comes no data. So they concluded that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen, and that the particular type of cancer in humans with which it was linked most closely was lymphoma. Mm-hmm. Since that time, in 2015, there have been several more big epidemiologic studies done of populations who are more heavily exposed to glyphosate than the general population. These are typically farmers and pesticide applicators. Mm-hmm. And these studies have actually reaffirmed and strengthened the link between glyphosate and lymphoma. And now we have the new study from the Ramazzini Institute showing a link between glyphosate, leukemia, and multiple other cancers. I don't know if IARC plans to revisit glyphosate in the near future or not. It'll be interesting to see if they do.
Of course, now we're trying to put a lid on the lawsuits that have been going on in this country
Yes, Monsanto has lost multiple lawsuits now. Monsanto Bayer have lost multiple lawsuits and running into many hundreds of millions of dollars. And as you say, they've been trying to work through the Congress to get a provision into one bill or another that would basically protect the industry against lawsuit. You know, there's a precedent for that. The nuclear industry under something called the Price-Anderson Act is free of any liability if a nuclear reactor in this country blows up. So if the new reactor that Governor Hochul wants to put in upstate New York should blow up one of these days, the industry would be exempt from any liability, and the burden would fall upon the citizens of New York and Pennsylvania.
She just doesn't understand the science. She just doesn't get it. She has always been a business and industry friendly governor. And we've got Bitcoin, we've got AI, and both of which require enormous amounts of energy. And that's where we are, Phil.
Yeah.
So, Phil, given what's happening in the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States in the recent months, do you expect any change in regulation around glyphosate?
No, not in today's EPA. I mean, Administrator Zeldin has very happily rolled back rules and regulations on a whole series of well-known environmental hazards. He's announced his intention to relax the standards on PM 2.5 air pollution, airborne mercury poisoning. I can't imagine that he would take action to protect American citizens against glyphosate. I mean, one of the things that I'm very worried about is what are going to be the impacts on human health of the current rollbacks of environmental safeguards. You know, the Trump administration and Administrator Zeldin like to talk about these as regulations. He actually used the phrase shackles on American industry, totally ignoring the reality that, in fact, these regulations their primary purpose is not to hold back industry at all. Their primary purpose is to challenge industry to do the right thing to protect public health. And that when they roll back these regulations, people die. And I was part of a large group who analyzed the impacts on the health of Americans of environmental rollbacks during the first Trump administration from 2017 to 2021. And we calculate that there were about 20,000 excess deaths in those years as a consequence of rollbacks of environmental and occupational standards. And sadly, ironically, those deaths were concentrated in red states, states that had voted for Mr. Trump. And for two reasons. Those states sort of in a corridor going south from Michigan down through Ohio to Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, to the Gulf Coast, Alabama, Mississippi. There are states that have a lot of industry, number one, and number two, there are states that typically have very weak state agencies and therefore very little capacity to buffer or insulate the citizens of the state against the federal cutbacks. So the very people that voted for Mr. Trump died disproportionately under his first watch due to his environmental and occupational rollbacks.
Dr. Philip Landrigan, pediatrician, public health expert, and director of the Program for Global Public Health and the Common Good, and the director of the Global Observatory on Planetary Health at the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society at Boston College. You can learn more about Dr. Landrigan and find links to his work on our program website, greenstreetnews.org. That's going to do it for this edition of Green Street. Patti and I will be back next week with another edition of the show. Thanks for listening.